Good morning all. I'd like to welcome you to the Climate and Environment Subcommittee meeting on the 2nd of May. First of all, I think Mr Moore is going to read the council blessing.
As we deliberate on the issues before us, we trust that we will reflect positively on the communities we serve. Let us all seek to be effective and just, so that with courage, vision and energy, we provide positive leadership in the spirit of harmony and compassion.
Thank you, Mr Moore. So the next item, item 3, is apologies. So I have an apology from the Mayor, who's at a function in Wellington, and so her apology is for lateness. We have an apology from Mr Black from the Otaki Community Board, and he's been replaced by Mr Butler, who is already here. And we have 3 members of the committee on Zoom, Kim, Harry Y and Glenn. So I assume that they can hear us. So moving on to item 4, declarations of interest relating to items on the agenda. Does anyone have... Oh yes. Do we have, can I have a mover for, thank you, Councillor Warwick, seconder, Councillor Hanford. Thank you. Moving on to item 4, are there any declarations of interest relating to items on the agenda? Thank you. Next item, public speaking time for items on the agenda. I haven't been notified of any, so there are none. So then we'll move on to members' business. I'm not aware of any members' business. We're getting through the agenda really quickly here. So now we move on to item 7, and this is where we have 3 or 4 updates. So the first update is on the strategic work program. So I would like to ask Mr Jefferson to speak to that item, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Chris Purvin, who has been working with the councillors on the strategic work program, and I think the conversation this morning is about how this fits with the subcommittee's work program and how the two inform each other, and if there's any gaps from a subcommittee perspective, how we might address those. So it's a genuine conversation that Chris will lead us in. So over to you. Thanks, Chris.
Thank you. So the chair had circulated by email a copy of the council's priorities. So top 10 priorities themed, and there is 3 pages attached to the document that you have. The first page is focused on this year. So you'll see that we are focused on place, people and partnership as sort of implementing the agreed model that we're proposing to use for this triennium, and also to support work underway around engaging our community on a vision through to 2060. For each of place, people and partnership, there is an assessment of need in the community, what priority that links to is developed by council and council laws actually, and targeted actions. The thing that is proposed to change through each year is the targeted actions. And so as we think about the work program that may be forming for this subcommittee around climate and the environment, in the place space, it's likely that there could be some really good alignment between what you may be interested in and focused on, and landing some thoughts or expectations around the work that would be coming here, but also who you might want to talk to, and the sort of areas that you might like to focus on as that work progresses. I just want to note what it is and what it isn't, because that's important. What it is it represents a summary of the critical and important things that councillors heard as they were out and about through election campaigns and beyond, that the community was saying, here's some things that are important to us. So that's reflected here. There are other things that we do. I don't want to say business as usual. There's kind of things that the organisation does anyway. So that is not all on this list. It's not meant to be an exhausted list. And it doesn't mean that there might be some things in what you might call BAU that you would like to see coming here. So I just want to put that on the table. How I think this might help your conversation today is to have a bit of a focus on that play space and to unpack perhaps some of the thinking you have around what you'd like to see coming through, which would help shape the work that we then bring to this table. So if I used an example of developing a climate strategy and an environment strategy, you might want to think about actually who you think in the community might be valuable to give advice, who we might work with as we develop those items, what we might want to make sure that we cover in those strategies. So that's just a bit of a soundbite. What would you hand back to you, Jocelyn?
Thank you very much, Chris. This strategy or these priorities have, there's been a lot of work that's gone into these, and I think when you look at some of the other work streams that we're doing, there's a lot of overlap, and I think sometimes, not only in this committee but also in other committees, we get reports, but we don't quite know where they fit into the system. And I think this is something that we can refer to at times to give us an idea about where we're heading. Obviously, this is very high level, but I think it gives us a good opportunity to look at the big picture. So I will open it to the floor for questions, and I see that Councillor Coe has a question.
Yeah.
Thank you. Questions, please.
Yeah. Thanks, Chris. Look, I just would like to say that, yes, while we need to focus on the place part of this, to me, partnership is really, really important in this space. Because if we're looking at waste minimisation and emissions reduction and all that kind of thing, we can't do that without engagement with our community. And so I think there's an overlap there that we need to explore further, and getting information out to our community, engaging with them, upskilling them, informing them. We're not going to achieve our objectives without that. So I think we can use this area, the place area, as a vehicle for increasing our level of engagement with the community. So I think, look at them hand in hand. And like, for example, we've got waste minimisation on the agenda today. To me, that's crying out for some, councillor videos or something like that, We can continue. Yeah, but true. I know. Well, why not though? But I mean, we need to be engaging with our people out there and saying to them how important this is for our community.
So thank you, Councillor Coe, for that. And I agree with what you're saying. And I suppose also too, we have these 10 priorities, but in many respects, it's a framework. And so each of, decisions that are made in the environment will affect our growth, and our growth will affect our environment, and how and all that is connected with our people as well. So it's actually all these three main areas are very, very interconnected, and I think we need to be very mindful of that and actually look at how they all operate outside that individual area as well. Yeah, thank you. So, Councillor Hanford.
Yeah, no, definitely think that maybe some videos as a way of interfacing with the public would work, and cool to have potentially the Climate and Environment Subcommittee kind of fronting some of that as well, so that the community board members have some visibility in terms of their connection to this work, which I think we're we're on the cusp of some quite exciting things happening in our climate space, especially with the addition of some awesome new staff as well. And would just echo Councillor Coe's comments around partnership. I think another really important group of people to add to that list is mana whenua, and we know how important mātauranga Māori and Indigenous knowledge is in truly restoring that balance between us as people and the natural world. And so looking at this from that perspective or through that lens, which our mana whenua partners will, I'm sure, have their own views on how we approach action in this space, and thinking about it obviously from the point of reducing emissions, but then further to that, what a rebalancing kind of looks like, and how we as people and as communities can get ourselves kind of on that journey and making that happen. I think another really important thing for this subcommittee is the kind of oversight over measuring progress towards our emissions reduction targets, and also the state of the environment as well, having those regular updates as to what the state of our natural world is, and just kind of bringing some awareness to that and the potential gaps and where we're letting things kind of fall through the cracks or under the radar. But specifically, the emissions reduction side of things, having regular updates on kind of where our emissions are sitting, the potential opportunities that we haven't yet capitalised on, what it would look like to capitalise on those things, how much funding we're looking at, and therefore what would need to come through our annual plan and long-term planning processes in the future. And then this subcommittee could kind of champion some of those ideas, new ideas that already exist in the community. I know that community board member Jackie Elliott's really passionate about a couple of different groups and projects like coastal energy. There's different kind of renewable electricity generation projects that it would be great for this committee to have an update on. So just that general oversight, I think, is a really important role that this committee should and could play.
Thank you, Councillor Hanford. Kevin?
Thank you. I think just to add to that, Councillor Hanford, that one of the things that we'll be working on with you actually over the course of the next couple of months is a new outcomes framework focused on need, but the measures that go with that. And I do think that it would be useful for that framework to come through this committee, particularly around the aspects that link into, no matter in which way, climate and the environment, and to make sure that we do have a mana whenua perspective in that. And I think I'm just reflecting on the Ka Piti Whaitua process that our mana whenua partners have actually got quite a bit of evidence and thinking from that perspective that would be good to share at this forum. And they actually release a number of reports that I think would be really nice to bring here for discussion. It's a slightly different way of thinking about measuring progress, but very powerful.
Thank you, Ms. Purban. So, Tim.
Yeah, good morning, everybody, and sorry I was a little bit late. Thank you for this. It's really excellent. And Sophie's points are spot on. A couple of points, though. I think language is really important, and and just looking after our streams. Shouldn't we be protecting our streams? And I know it's small, but those words are important as to the aspiration of what we're trying to do. And the other one that just grabbed at me, and I've got a little bee in my bonnet about this partnership and communicating, but ensuring the community is involved in decisions. Ensuring, but aren't we supposed to be encouraging and helping people engage? And so if we were able to look at this wording, and I know it's not a full document or anything, but those words are important as to the actions, the aspirations that the subcommittee takes forward. So just a couple of small points. I could go through it, but I think language is really important.
Ms. Purban would like to make some comments.
Thank you. And I will just briefly say in the background to this that councillors have, as the chair had mentioned, undertaken several really intensive workshops to land this to the stage, and definitely keen to hear feedback such as that. We are going to have a follow-up. When I say we, councillors are having a follow-up workshop towards the end of the month to look at year 2 and 3 and to just refine and tighten what's on the table. So we'll pick up on those points so that we can feed it in and see what comes out the other side. So I just wanted to be clear that I've facilitated a process to support councillors to get to here, but this is very much councillor owned. And so we'll take that feedback forward. And I'm looking at the councillors around the table to go, that's my proposal. Yes. Excellent.
Thank you. Mr Judge.
Oh, kia ora, Chair. I just wanted to chip in about climate change and hazard management again, which I think will be a vital part of our work. I'm sure, I don't think anyone would be aware that Grant Robinson put out a press statement late yesterday afternoon, so why would you know unless you're watching his feed 24 hours a day? And this is to do with the cyclone recovery work that is ongoing. Have you seen? You're nodding. No. Okay. So clearly, there's a number of councils north of us that are dealing immediately with this as an emergency situation where they've had a lot of damage. And what's been announced yesterday, and I think this is something that we're going to have to pay attention to and apply here for ourselves, is they've got 3 categories of properties in different hazard areas. The first is it was flooded, but we don't see any ongoing particular elevated hazard, so you can just get on and rebuild there, and that's okay. The third one, and I'll come back to the second one shortly, is you're not rebuilding there. That's crazy, and something's going to happen so that you can't rebuild there and live there because it's deemed a risk to life. And then the category 2 in the middle is split in 2 to say that if you fix your house up this way, you'll be okay. And the other one is if local government enhances hazard protection, be that from flood, landslip, or whatever the hazard is, you will be okay to live there. But what it's saying is that something needs to change from how things were before if you are to continue to live there. Now, what there isn't in here at all is how local government goes around to identify which properties are in which category and what the metrics for that are. And I think we have an opportunity to learn from other councils that are going to go through this process as to how they are going to identify those things. I mean, this is new. There's hardly any detail to it, but we have the opportunity here to act ahead of time to protect our communities and our assets. Before it's our turn to be at the very, very sharp end of this of climate change. So I just ask the committee to note that this work is ongoing. There was this update late yesterday afternoon, so I appreciate people wouldn't have had the opportunity to see it. And hopefully there will be some more coming up that will be useful to the committee as we think about these issues for our community.
Mr Jefferson's going to make some comments, and I'm going to make some after that too.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Look, Christian, I listened to quite an interesting debate in Radio New Zealand coming up the motorway this morning from 2 mayors from the East Coast, one from Wairoa and the Hastings mayor. No detail, as you rightly point out. And the cynic in me says this will be more responsibility that will be devolved to councils to manage. And so we will watch it with great interest and try and get on the front foot. But I would like just to respond and say, Mr. Mallon's in the room, and he has a huge capital works program that is designed to mitigate future risk. The regulatory team are in regular wrestles and debates with developers about designing to a higher standard. Actually, all we can require them to do is the minimum current standards, but even that is a wrestle. So we're trying to do that readiness stuff, new stormwater modelling for the district. There's a whole lot of work going our challenge is to pull all of those threads together into something more comprehensive. What's been announced by central government is absolutely light on detail, and my fear driving up the motorway this morning was that it's just going to be more responsibility and potentially risk to councils to manage. And of course, we've seen in years gone by the challenge we have in addressing coastal adaptation. Both mayors this morning that were interviewed were great in theory, but the details lacking, and their fear is that it falls to local communities actually to manage themselves. So, thanks.
Sorry, just to add, district plan changes for flood and coastal hazard risk will be coming through next year, so 24 and 25. So there'll be an opportunity for those to come here to think about the implications of, I guess, what you're raising, Christian, and that we will have some, I'm going to say, good evidence that will be coming through from the CAP process in terms of what the community is thinking about coastal, as well as some work that the infrastructure area is currently progressing around better understanding flood risk and updating our own models to understand some of the implications of those things. So those will be coming through, as well as lining up with what Mr. James has just raised.
Thank you.
Yes, if I can just make some comments too. So as Ms. Purvin said, this is, we have these 3 sheets of paper, but as she said, there's other groups that are doing work around this. And I suppose, as she's mentioned, the coastal adaptation process, you've got the Whaitua process, which is probably slightly different. Plus, and you've also got our district plan, and in terms of, is that, are there some things in there that can be done in there to ensure that developers are, having a good footprint, and I mean a good footprint on our community. And then I suppose at the end of it, there's also compliance in terms of, are they actually walking the talk? So I very much hear what you're saying, and when you think about this area, you think about flood risk, and so really this whole strip of land is quite low lying, and we have a number of large streams and rivers, and then in behind us we have some quite large hills, and so you think we probably could be a bit vulnerable. In fact, we would be very vulnerable if we got a weather event like some of those other areas in the country. So, we do very seriously have to think about all this, but unfortunately we can't undo what we've got today. But it's about learning and moving forward. Thank you. So, Mr. Moore.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Look, I find these kind of framework documents really helpful for especially newly elected members to give us a sense of where we fit and how things can navigate through the bureaucratic process and to try to get some things done. And that gives quite a lot of clarity to people like myself. And applying this to our kind of little pocket of Te Horo, we've got kind of an environmental issue, I think, that supersedes everything in our kind of area at the moment. And it's the access, the only access, and I know I've brought this up before around this, and I don't want to get this into detail because it will be a separate subject to look at some more mitigation issues. The only access road in and out of Te Horo Beach community is one road in and one road out, and there's nothing surer, of course, than it's going to be affected again by rising water, by water off the Tararuas. 2 weeks ago, when we had a quite a heavy rainfall on a Friday, I think it was, we got some substantial surface flooding at the upper part of it, which hadn't happened for some time. So there's at least 4 inflection points along there, and I heard what Councillor Coe said about partnerships with community, and that's critical. But we have another problem with a partnership going up the other way through the regional council, because this problem has dual responsibilities. And as long as I can recall, that road has been a football politically to say the road is not our problem, and then the other group says the stream is not our problem. In fact, it's a joint problem and it needs resolving. And when this issue comes up, and I look through these kind of place people in partnerships to resolve and navigate issues through, that nothing gets done. And I see a photo put up of a group of people in lovely high-vis vests and saying, here we are, we were talking about this at 2015 flood or 2021. And not only is it going to occur again, it's going to get worse, I suspect. So I would hope that something like this can not only assist in building a better partnership with regional council to get something done, but something on capital works can assist in having a more resilient access road for an entire community, unique in the entire Kapiti district, that does not have this problem.
Thank you, Mr. Moore. Mr. Jefferson would like to make a few comments.
Yeah, look, thank you, Madam Chair. And in fact, that's a conversation Chris and I were having at about 9:10 this morning about roles and responsibilities throughout this work program, between regional council and other regulators and us. And we are meeting with GW's leadership team, I think within the next month, to start to talk about how we can collaborate better. The only observation I'd make coming back into the region after having worked in Auckland before the merger, the relationships are better here, even though we don't always think that. But there's certainly a whole lot of work we can do in terms of those roles and responsibilities being really, really clear and making sure things don't become a political football and don't just get kicked around for years and years while communities suffer. So it is the conversation we had earlier this morning, so thank you. Noted.
Thank you, Mr. Jefferson. So, Councillor Warwick.
Well, my question is around the district plan and then the ability for developers to bypass the consenting process and fast track consents, and how can we affect that if we have a plan for the district and then they can come in and do their own thing effectively anyway? How do we deal with that?
Thanks through the chair. Great question. So the fast track consenting appears to expire on the 1st of July.
Yeah.
I say appears because there might be a political appetite to leave it open for a little bit longer. I suspect not, but let's see. But in theory, the consenting panel should be taking our district plan rules into consideration. And we do get a very limited opportunity for our planners to make an assessment of the application and feeding back to the panel. We're not sure how much weight. We've had a couple, and we're not convinced there's a lot of weight attached to those. But there is a mechanism, but I think the fast track consenting has probably had its day, but we'll wait and see. But it's a good question about whether they can circumvent our planning, and in theory that shouldn't be happening.
Thank you for that question. I knew it was coming to an end, but I wasn't quite sure. But I do have a question, I hope you don't mind, Mr. Jefferson, is that, so when that consent is actually, a consent is given, who actually has oversight for ensuring that it's actually complied with?
Yeah, great question. Just following on from my cynicism earlier, all care and no responsibility from the consenting panel. Monitoring of consent falls to this council with some limited charging and cost recovery regimes. So, yep, all care and no responsibility if I was being really cynical.
Thank you, Mr. Jefferson. So we have, do you have any further questions?
I just wanted to ask,
Yes.
so how many developments currently are in the middle of that fast track consenting process in the district? Do you know, or you can come back to us? It would be interesting to know how many are sitting there, and if they've already applied and then the fast track consenting ends, their application still stands with.
Yeah, through the chair. Look, I'd be guessing at the numbers I can get, but it's less than a handful. Yeah, two's the number. Chris has confirmed that. But yes, if they get in before the 1st of July, even if they get in with a half-baked application, which we might see a bit of a rush on, or should I say EPA might see a bit of a rush on, they'll still be in that process, and therefore our abilities are somewhat more limited to shape that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Jefferson. So now we have Kim on Zoom. Can you hear us, Kim?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Kia ora. Kia ora tātou. Just a couple of things. I agree with what everyone's saying at the table. And if I go through all those papers, this is, it's a complex issue that needs a multifaceted approach to fix it. But the things that stand out for me as I read through all the papers, one, and it applies not only to this committee, but it applies to committees in general, is that the system that we use to implement things and try and make things better, to me seems outdated and systematically flawed, because it was created in a different society. It was created in a society where maybe people were still of the same values. There was a larger proportion of the community that were together on things, and now we live in a very individualistic society. So, and I think that's a story for another day. But when I go through the reports and listen to all this talk, we talk about dealing with the output. So we talk about dealing with the consequences of what happens when we do this, what happens when we do this. So does this committee, and I know it's the harder question, but when do we start to talk about and try and influence the inputs? And if I'm being completely honest, the biggest impact on the environment is us. It's us. We want a flat park. We want a flat back lawn. We want to have convenience foods. It's us. We are the biggest destroyers of the environment that you can think of. But then we're not going to get rid of us, clearly. So then I think about all the inputs, things like basic things when I go to the supermarket, and there are things that I won't buy because the packaging's not recyclable. But then I'm in the store having a battle with my children. No, you can't get that because I don't like the packaging. So where do we influence that? Yes, you can bring those products in, but your packaging must fit, blah, blah, blah. Where can we influence the inputs so that the impact is not so great, so that because we're just playing catch up. There's more and more waste being created, and we're just trying to fix that part. But if the waste never comes in my simple brain, then that problem goes away to an extent. Very simplified view of it all. Secondly, it's about, I'm a strong believer that people make change, not policies. So we seem to be in this world where we make a rule, so that's the bottom line. And once we make that rule, that's as far as anyone goes. Everyone just goes to the bottom line and that's it. So then our magic plan is to make a bigger rule, and then they lift their game up a little bit. But the onus never falls on the people creating, say developers or whoever it is, creating the waste. And if I refer back to and how I was brought up in Te Ao Māori, when you went to the beach to get pippies, if you got small baby pippies, you were told to put them back, fundamentally, because they're the babies, they're the next generation, so you can only get a certain amount. You throw back the first one, all these things. But these are little basic things that kept the environment well, and it wasn't because of a law, it wasn't because of a rule, it wasn't because of the chief of Ngāti Raukawa said so. It was just a common knowledge thing, and a common, I can't think of the word to describe it, but it was just a common value that you had. And that's what I mean by people make change, not policies. If we really want to make change, we need to start figuring out a way to make that cultural change in people. We can go on emptying our rubbish bins and recycling things for the rest of our lives, but people are inherently greedy and will keep making waste. So I know it's a harder task, but when do we get to that side of things? And is Is that in the remit of this committee? And that's probably my own 2 questions.
Thank you, Kim, very, very much for your comments. And I actually agree with you completely on a number of facets. And first of all, I hear what you're saying in terms of about putting the baby pippies back. It's about, and that understanding comes from living in an environment and actually understanding, I suppose, those natural life forces. And I suppose a lot of people have lost contact with probably our natural environments a lot more than other people. So I also agree with your comment in relation to the inputs, and I have to admit, you've forced me to preempt one of the questions I have for the waste minimisation presentation we have. And so with that there, it's about minimising waste. It's not actually looking at how we can stop it occurring in the first instance. And, that is something that, as you said, it's people who make these changes, not policy. And so, I thank you for your comments. So I think Ms. Purvin's also got some comments to make.
Yeah, thank you, the Chair and Kim. I just want to note that I think that is a really good example of what we would imagine the discussion or the upcoming discussion on developing the climate strategy would get into. So today you are going to hear from the team who are doing some really good work on waste minimisation. So it's current things we have underway. Through the strategy, we'll be looking at what else can we focus on, and the point about people making change, not policies, and that cultural shift and what more needs to happen. And I think actually, Councillor Coe, you've linked into this before as well, talking about education and awareness and how we're supporting people to be part of the solution. That would be on the table here. So as we start to get into what does the climate strategy need to focus on, where are we now, what more can we do, that would be some of what we'd imagine would be on the table here for discussion with you. And also, some of you have been talking about bringing experts into this conversation to hear from others. So we'd imagine that becomes part of that as well. And including, and I think as we mentioned before, Kim, mana whenua insight and perspectives on how we might do things differently. So that would be, when we talk about a climate strategy, I think it seems quite abstract, but I think that is starting to bring to life what we're trying to do and the conversation we're trying to have, not just here, but with the community.
Thank you, Ms. Purvin. So, Councillor Hanford.
Oh, sorry, I've just got one other question, kind of off the back of what Kim was talking about too. What role do you see, I don't know who this is best directed to, but any one of you three, what role do you see the subcommittee having in the kind of advocacy space? Like, for example, if the subcommittee wanted to write an open letter, kind of with all of its members signing on to, potentially to some of our larger kind of corporations or businesses in the district, to say that this is the work that we're undertaking as a council. We're trying to lead, we're trying to rebalance between people and the planet, we're trying to reduce emissions as quickly as we can, reduce waste. What are you going to do to kind of come on board with that journey? Do you see that being a role that the subcommittee can kind of help to lead, or kind of help to like catalyse as a response? I think advocacy has to be a function, because there's only so much that we can, and we had this conversation around district-wide emissions, is that when 57% of our emissions in the district are from transport, Greater Wellington obviously plays a big role in enabling us to meet the kind of targets that we want to meet. And if we're wanting to be ambitious, which we are, to then actually do that, we need other people to come to the table, but we need to make a really strong case as to why it's so crucial that we are ambitious now, because we're running out of time to address this crisis. So, long way of saying the role of this subcommittee in the advocacy space.
Thank you, Councillor Ham, for that. And I think this is a very good that's a very good example of what this subcommittee could do potentially. you've also got our whole council, and then also too, I think I've mentioned this before, when you've got the National Government Conference, they have a whole lot of remits they put through, and there's the opportunity to use that vehicle as well.
Can I just
Thank
chip
you.
in there? Because we do have that Sustainable Business Network, and I think that's the means by which we influence businesses. I know it's not advocacy, but I think what we should be striving to do is to get all our big businesses engaged with that initiative. Yeah, and there was a meeting at the chamber around a BA5 on it the other day. So I think that's where we can put our focus. Rather than making a lot of noise about it, we should be approaching these businesses and saying, you know, here's a framework, some templates, just encouraging that sort of activity.
Thank you, Councillor Coe. That's a very good point, and I think that's, you know, there's a lot of food for thought that's come out of this this update today. So as there's no more people wanting to make questions, I did ask for questions, but comments as well. Thank you for that, and thank you for the presentation. Yes. So now we'll move on to.
From the discussion today, and off the back of the priorities, we didn't table today, but I know that you will have all looked at the strategy, operations and finance work program. If you haven't, we can circulate it. But essentially, there's a number of items in there that I imagine would be of relevance to this subcommittee. So we'll be working with the chair and the deputy chair to condense what we've heard from you today and to identify the things that we think would be coming through in a forward agenda, which would be, we're proposing would be part of this process. That forward agenda, of course, there'll be opportunities to add to that. So, you know, as we do work, we might discover there's additional things we want. So it won't be an exhausted list. It'll be the starting platform for discussion. You can expect to see in there the process that we're planning to take with some of the work that is already noted in these priorities, and that would be starting here and then pushing up through some of the other committees. So we would come back to you, I think, with permission of the chair, once we've got that framework to perhaps test that we have heard you today, that we've picked up on your points, and then eventually it would come back to be tabled here so that we can publicly state the focus you'll be having.
Thank you, Councillor Coe, for raising that, and for Ms. Purven for your comments. And so I suppose the way that this, you know, this is a very new committee, and you know, it's still being developed on how it's actually going to operate. And so you'll see that we actually get a number of updates rather than reports which have recommendations. And I suppose, you know, that's something that we can take back. I think I'd like to have a conversation with, and how we can actually have some real recommendations and formal actions that do come out from some of the very, very good conversations we're having in the subcommittee. Thank you. So now we'll move on to the a conversation around the open space strategy. So I think, is it Gareth Eloff is going to come and speak to that, and Mike Mendonca. So welcome to the table. So while they're getting themselves organised, I'd like to thank staff for, in this, even though this is an update, in our papers, there's a couple of links in there which actually do go to the actual strategies, which I think is actually, it's really, really useful background reading. Thank you. So,
thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thank you very much for your time this morning, subcommittee members. I'd like to first of all introduce Gareth Eloff. If you haven't met Gareth already, Gareth's been with us for a year or so. He is our manager, Parks, Open Spaces and Environment. Gareth comes to us with a rich history, both in South Africa and New Zealand, of working in parks and open spaces, and has got some toe-curling stories about his time in South Africa as a game warden in particular. So the open spaces strategy, this is almost exactly 1 year old now. So in the last triennium, this was approved by councillors. It's an excellent blueprint of the way forward for us around our open spaces. A couple of things about this. First of all, it has the council's top 10 priorities for open spaces. There's a very strong overlap between those top 10 and the council top 10 priorities that you've recently agreed. So I just want to make the point that there's a lot of overlap, a lot of affinity, and there's nothing in here that's inconsistent with what you've agreed for this triennium. The second thing is this is organised by 9 different classifications of open space. And the way we're going to approach this morning, just for 10 minutes, we're only going to speak for 10 minutes or so, is Gareth's going to take you through each of those 9 and just really focus on the highlights for you, rather than trying to cover everything that's in here, trying to cover the stuff that's topical and that we think is stuff that is happening now, that you should be across more so than other stuff. Of course, this tells us what we're going to do, but also what we're not going to do, and it's really useful in that regard. And two key themes in here. One is there is a strong link with climate change adaptation in particular, the discussion you've just been having. And also, we can't talk about Te Taio, of course, without mana whenua being really interested and strongly involved in everything that we do. So everything that Gareth does has a really strong mana whenua connection and influence. So our job now, we've got this beautiful document, is to actually implement it. That's what Gareth's trying to do now. It's easy to write a document, it's much harder to actually make stuff happen. And so we do have some real challenges in the same way that other parts of the business do. For example, cost to do stuff is really escalated more so than it has in the infrastructure side. So it's really, really expensive to get stuff done. So that's always an issue for us. Also, managing expectations. If you dig a hole and stick a pipe in, then expectations, generally speaking, don't change. But with stuff like this and related stuff like indoor sports stadiums and new parks, expectation and public excitement is massive. So managing expectations is another area that we spend a lot of time focusing on. And increasingly, biodiversity is something that we're really, really passionate about in this area in particular. And it's really emerging. The link between recreation and biodiversity is kind of is getting stronger over time, and we're finding that those two things are increasingly becoming the same thing, which is not how we designed our parks and open spaces 25 years ago. And the other thing is, of course, the interface with water, and it's something that Councillor Pravanov is hugely passionate about. You can't talk about water quality without talking about land use and open space. So increasingly, that's a challenge for us. And of course, the enforcement agency for water is generally speaking different than the one for land use. So that's increasingly a challenge for us and something that we're focusing on a lot. But finally, growth. As we grow, the pressure on us to manage these expectations and our assets is immense. There are immense risks around that, but there are also huge opportunities. And if we get it right, there are some great things we can do around our cycleway network, parks, open spaces and playgrounds. But that's enough from me. I'll leave Gareth to talk through the 9 areas just quickly, and then we've got plenty of time for questions and discussion afterwards. Thanks, Gareth.
Yeah. Thank you. Ngā mihi nui kia koutou katoa. Yeah, Mike probably stole a little bit of my thunder with some of that intro. Yep, that's it. But we'll still soldier through regardless. Yeah, so as Mike mentioned, yeah, been about a year now. Open space strategy, a fantastic document to inherit and to work on. Sorry, which one do I? Oh, I tried that one. Okay. Yeah. So what I thought I'd do is I'd quickly, because of the benefit of it being a fairly new strategy and the fact that it's quite a new committee, I'll do a little bit of speed dating, open space speed dating 101 in the beginning, just to get everyone up to speed. So the fundamental of the strategy is to actually look at connecting our community with a vibrant, diverse, thriving and interconnected open space network, enhancing the mode of both. So that sounds really great, but what does it look like in practice? And I believe a picture says 1,000 words. So if we look at the landscape, we're looking at various categories or classifications of the 9 types of open space that Mike referred to, and how they fit in a landscape. And in particular, being the Kapiti Coast, District Council, an emphasis on the mountains to sea component as well, and how all our various categories of open space fit together. What is fundamental, as Mike did allude to, is that whakapapa, wairua mana, maramatanga, ta'au, Tūrua and Māori are all intrinsically involved or interwoven into our values, objectives, and approaches in applying those 10 priorities in open space provision and management and maintenance. Those 10 categories, I'll spend a little bit of time on just going through what they look like in the real world, starting with district-wide parks. So district-wide parks or destination parks are exactly what the name says. It's the kind of open space that someone will travel to get a enjoyment of or experience it from, not necessarily within the local area only, but could be from outside the district, from within the wider community, and also across the country. We've got some really good examples of those, like Waikanai Park, Mazengob Reserve, Haruatai, McLean Park, Marine Gardens. And it's also probably worthwhile mentioning that these aren't discrete classifications. Sometimes our reserves and parks might display characteristics of multiple types of open space, either at any given time or at stages during their evolution. Lorna Irene is one of those reserves that I would quite happily say has actually been regarded as a destination park right now because of its accessibility components that people from all over Lower North Island are actually coming to experience at the moment, which is fantastic. Sports fields, Mazengob, obviously it's a destination park as well, but quite a premier turf facility for hockey in particular, very well utilised. Iwi practices and values being quite well represented at Kenakena with the Kenakena Waharoa. Nice piece of work that we took on fairly early on in the establishment or entrenching of the new team was getting the Waharoa just revamped and zhuzhed up a little bit to its current state, which looks pretty good. Heritage, open space values being protected and looked after in our cemeteries. Local parks, there's Lorna Irene, the wonderful Lorna Irene that I spoke about. Very well utilised by the local community, but as I say, kind of displaying characteristics of a district-wide park as well at the moment. Nature reserves, Barry Hatfield, wonderful site, very well utilised, an amazing sense of place that people get when they walk through it. And ecological linkages and recreation corridors, probably one of the most well-known open space types that are experienced by the majority of Kapiti coasters, I think, in terms of cycling, walkways, bridleways. And urban open space. So the kind of outdoorsy areas that we can make use of while we're going about our day-to-day busy lives in the more urbanised areas. So to focus on the three core areas that were actually unpacked out of that whole suite of opportunity, one of the primary pieces of work we're looking at is our corridors and linkages, but with a predominant focus on tracks and trails and our beach access ways. So in terms of a recreational tracks and trails, we are building onto this strategy. Hopefully you can see most of those lines, where it actually incorporates linkages in partnership with both the likes of the regional council, Department of Conservation, and identified routes that are either already there or opportunities to grow in the future, to actually pretty much have that entire mountains to sea experience captured, and also from a north-south experience that would one day evolve into perhaps even commuter routes for people to use as alternatives to day-to-day transportation. And beach access ways. This is a major piece of work at the moment. We currently know of 126 beach access ways across our 40 kilometres of coastline. There's a huge diversity of expectation in this space in terms of the quality, in terms of the type of beach access required or wanted, and also what we're able to deliver. So there is a big piece of work coming through at the moment to reassess and recommend a prioritised approach to managing beach access and where we're going to invest or where we should be investing our money in terms of assets and through our asset management plans. Second focus areas, we're going to focus on destination parks. This is both in terms of development and upgrade, accommodating growth within our existing network, but also in terms of compiling our fit-for-purpose asset management plans. This will be, as I say, the second area of focus for us. And the third area is, as has been alluded to a few times this morning already, a lot of growth in the area. With that growth comes opportunity to not only build onto our existing network, but also enhance our open space provision within the sites that we already have. And the way that we do that is by looking into the appropriate and more targeted application of our reserve contributions, how that looks on the ground, and filling in the gaps appropriately. So not just going to defaults of, let's say, building a new playground, but looking at the development catchment areas of that particular site. What are the shortfalls? What's required? And perhaps moving on to, if local provisions are sufficient, that could be used then to, as in a district-wide component, enhance open space provision at a district-wide or destination park level in another area. And that, in a nutshell, would be open space strategy speed dating 101. Yeah.
So, have any questions, Madam Chair?
So thank you very much. Do any members have any questions? Kim, online.
Kia ora. Can everybody hear me? Yeah. Hi.
Yes, we can hear you, Kim.
Oh, great.
Thank you. Off you go.
Just a couple of things. Well, one in particular is about zero harm, zero impact in my head. So when we're thinking, and so we have a lot of open spaces, flat, lovely, everyone wants a nice park, you can sit at, that's great. But when we build that space, what we do is we destroy the ecosystem that's there. So basically, we wipe out what's there and we replace it with something.
Actually, Kim, if you just hold on a moment, I think we've got some technical issues. I'm not sure whether it's at your end or whether it's with our system. So have another go.
I'll see if I can get.
Yeah, that's better. Yeah, that's better.
Yeah, I'm just going closer to the internet. So it's about zero harm, zero waste. And in a nutshell, it's about if we want to build a nice, pretty flat park, open space, all nicely growing, then do we then invest in somewhere else where, because we've already impacted the environment to make that space for us and we want it, do we then go and invest in another area to make up, to create the balance? Do you see what I mean? To create the environmental balance. Because we do have a lot of these flat spaces. Our growth is off the Richter. And so there's more places where it's flat, there's no trees, it's just nice and grass, things like that. And so is there ever any consideration to, okay, we want to build this park. What does that mean from the environment? So to build that park, we must find a place to invest so that we can either balance off the impact or reduce it significantly. And if I think about, I looked at the picture where it says beach access and you've got steps there. Well, yes, while it's easier to build a step because it's less maintenance in the future and it's less cost, beach access, it's a beach. Do we need to add things to the environment just to make our lives better if the impact on the environment is higher than the actual benefit to us? Just things like that. I just want to be thinking about, if we're going to take away from Papatūānuku, let's put back. It might not be in the same place, might be in a different place, but let's also invest so that the balance always stays the same. How practical that is, how you do that, I don't know. Just my 2 cents. That's all.
So would Gareth or Mike like to make some comments? Thank you, Kim, for your comments.
Yeah, thanks, Kim, and kia ora. I think it's fair to say we don't have an equation in the way that you're talking about offsets and unders and overs. Although, sometimes when there's a developer through the resource consent process, that is a requirement to have offsets, but that tends to be quite transactional. I think you're talking more aspirationally. So we don't have an equation per se, but I can assure you that when we look at our destination parks, and if I take Waikanae Park, for example, the piece of bush in the middle of Waikanae Park is increasingly valued by various communities in the district because of its uniqueness and because of where it is. And so as we come to develop up Waikanae Park with our partners, we're specifically looking at the biodiversity. And earlier on I mentioned how biodiversity and recreation are kind of coming together as we value our bush in particular and our water more and more. So while we don't have an equation along the lines that you're suggesting, we do absolutely have a philosophy where we look to make sure we're investing equally in biodiversity at the same time that we invest in concrete and steel stuff and sports fields. And just the other thing, Kim, I'd mention is that we're coming to talk to the SO&F committee later this year with our play strategy. And play increasingly, I think I mentioned before, we're looking at the cost and maintenance of some of our playground equipment and how horrifically expensive that stuff is to buy and to maintain. But if you look at what that stuff actually does, it's kind of the same as the experience a tree might give you, or a mudslide, or a more natural piece of play. Well, we can call it equipment. So increasingly we want to, and actually, and shade, yeah. So shade provided by a tree is as effective as shade by one of those expensive shade cloths. So we're really keen when we bring that strategy back to you to talk about how we might come back to some of these more natural interventions, which not only kind of look better, they're actually cheaper, and actually make some of us feel quite nostalgic for our own childhood. So I hope that gives you a sense. We don't have an equation in the sense that you're suggesting, but we certainly have a philosophy that is very much aligned with what you're suggesting. Over.
So thank you again, Kim, and thank you, Mike, for your comments. And I suppose it's, it's very much a balancing act. And I suppose it depends on what people's values are and people's priorities. But I was just ask, one of the things that you talked about was beach access, and maybe I can ask staff for a comment here, is that obviously there's lots of beach accesses, and I don't know whether they're looking at rationalisation of some of those, but it's a case of where by building beach access, it encourages the population to use particular places rather than going down to the beach anywhere, which is actually quite destructive on the dunes. And so how does all that, are you thinking about those sorts of things?
Yeah, completely. So there are a number of aspects to this, and we haven't solved it yet, but we're working on it. Yes, we have an abundance of beach accesses, some of which are council owned and constructed, many of which aren't, sort of informal beach accesses. A lot of those are facing the wrong direction. They are facing oriented towards the north, which means the prevailing wind actually hammers them, and every time we go to do some maintenance, it costs us an arm and a leg. One of the things that Gareth is looking at, I'll let Gareth talk a bit to this in a moment, is to actually orient more of them to the south so that doesn't happen. At the same time, there's a lot of custom and practice, as you know, around access to beach in all parts of our coastline. And this is an issue across the country. We have a really good bylaw, but the enforceability of that bylaw, as you know, is fraught. So that's another issue that we are looking at. I can speak about Te Horo in more detail if you like shortly. But I need to advise the subcommittee that there is no easy answer to a lot of this stuff. We're actually working closely with Takutai Kapiti as well, because a lot of these things do overlap, so we're not working in isolation here. But this is a tough gig, and there are going to be some tough choices that we have to make. Interesting that GW has closed a whole bunch of beach accesses on QE Park. And actually fenced them off. A lot of people ignore those fences, but they're making an effort. It's much easier to do that when you don't have people living there, of course, and you don't have the same sense of custom and practice as we do with our beach access ways. But this is an issue around the country, and I guess we're watching what's going on everywhere else, but it's probably more important for us as the Kapiti Coast District Council than it is for any other district in the Wellington region. I don't know if you want to add anything, Gareth.
Just maybe very, very briefly. Yeah, so the rationalisation is definitely a consideration that we're putting together a paper at the moment, which is going to tie into our activity or asset management plans as well. So being able to strategically, in combination with Tukatai Kapiti and that, look at sites that warrant investment in actual asset infrastructure development or rebuilding versus those that are less maintained versus those that are completely informal. The reality is that, as you say, people tend to walk where they want to walk, which is why we've got 126 beach access ways at the moment. There will have to be an element of rationalisation. What that looks like, we don't quite know yet, but we'll be coming back with those considerations.
But we're highly aware of the anxiety that this might have on some parts of our community, and we need to bring the community with us. So we're critically aware of the consultation and engagement that will need to happen before we even start to think about doing anything with beach accesses.
Thank you for that. So, any more? Yeah. Thank you, Gareth and Mike, for that. So it's amazing how long, how much can be said about beach access, really. So now we have Christian, who has hopefully some questions or comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for the presentation. It's just some general comments, and there's some questions wrapped in here as well. My major concerns are sort of adaptation and resilience. As I note from we have these categorizations, which is a useful taxonomy for describing what you're doing. But overall, and I'm aware that sort of the promotion of natural systems as a way of managing climate impacts is a very effective thing to do. So but the question there is what is the balance that's sought to be struck between when you're looking at developing a park or something, or an outdoor asset, as to providing sort of an amenity, or compared to looking at what would be best for the environment and climate resilience, managing, say, flood water or drought, etc., building that and then saying, okay, well, that's going to really help the community in a climate sense. Now, how do we develop the leisure activities around that compared to, right, we want a park and we want it all grass or something like that. The next thing there is, are there opportunities? We've got some of our waterways and stormwater systems where they are open, what the opportunities are for riparian planting around those for biodiversity and waterway health. And then also, linking back to the first comment stroke question is, we have the opportunity when we are looking at climate change mitigation and planting to absorb CO2, what the balance there is between sort of maximising any, if you were looking at a revenue stream from being within the ETS and having qualifying forestry there, would you be looking to maximise sort of offsets and carbon absorption compared to the enhanced biodiversity value and, say, particularly on slopes where you might have permanent forestry that was native that didn't maximise the potential for absorbing carbon, but did give you a whole load of other things to do with biodiversity and increase resilience, because you don't have the problems around harvesting, the exposure to the land, because we saw with great effect from the cyclone where the impacts of slash and forestry waste being washed down when a slope had been completely clear felled, and then they just get wiped out when a cyclone comes through, compared to if you had that in native bush that just stayed there permanently, a lot less carbon absorbed, but a whole load of other amenities provided in stopping that hill ending up in someone's back garden or wiping out people. So yeah, that's my questions is, what thought is given to balancing the benefits of natural systems to help manage us through climate impacts, and and then also about what thought is given to areas that can be used for carbon sequestration.
So there's a piece of legislation called the Reserves Act, which drives most of what we can and can't do around reserves. I forget how many pieces of reserve land we have. 500. We have hundreds of pieces of reserve land, only of which a few are actually used for recreational purposes. And actually, as Gareth mentioned earlier on, there are often competing uses for those. So some of these reserves are actually infrastructure easements with gas pipelines or cables going, or in case of Waikanae Park, with Transpower going straight through the middle of it. So, and stormwater reserve is one of the uses for some of these pieces of land. Each piece of reserve land, we are supposed to produce a reserve management plan. Gareth is in the middle of doing this at the moment. It's a massive piece of work that the Waikanae Community Board's been watching very closely. It's a massive piece of work that we're kind of 25% of the way through, 20% of the way through. Going through this exact issue of trying to categorise land and which of those reserve needs is the dominant one, because in some places there are 3 or 4 different needs on that piece of land. But coming to the guts of your question around climate mitigation, the open spaces strategy talks predominantly about adaptation rather than mitigation, and we're actually quite comfortable with that because most of the land in our district that is useful for planting of exotics in particular is actually not our land. Most of the land that we own is not suitable for exotics, and also I think that by and large, as is outlined in the strategy, the great preference of the council is to plant where we are planting an indigenous rather than exotic. So with respect to mitigation, we don't have a lot of sway with our own estate in terms of carbon absorption. So I think I guess the story I'm saying is that we'll be going indigenous wherever we can for a number of reasons. One being just pure practicality, because the land ours tends not to be the hill land. The stuff you see up the back here is mostly private or regional council stuff. But I take your point about the environmental impacts of that. But actually, a lot of that is actually beyond our means to actually control. In fact, we've done a bit of work looking at that. There is some advice floating around that we're happy to circulate about what's going on up behind Boat City and what you're probably concerned about. I hope that helps.
Thank you, Christian, and thank you, Mike, for your response. So, Councillor Coe.
Oh, yeah. Thanks, guys. Look, to me, wearing my economic development hat, there is a really strong linkage between ED and the open spaces strategy. Because if, we talk about telling the Kapiti story, and our open spaces are very much part of that story. So I'm just wondering how that linkage happens in practical terms. I know Janice Hill, for example, has done quite a lot of work on the trail side of things, and that's got a linkage into the destination management plan, that kind of thing. But just wondering how can we kind of strengthen that relationship and be looking at open spaces through that lens of visitor attraction, and what are the kinds of things that people are looking for. Is there some research we can do to find out, what would bring more people to Kapiti, for example, what kind of facilities we would need to have in our open spaces to bring them here.
Thanks, Councillor. So at multiple levels within the council, we do engage between ED and in parks and open spaces. So Chris and I speak about this regularly, and Mark Ward and Gareth speak quite a bit. 2 key areas we're looking at. One is the cycleway, walkway, right away, the CWB network. And actually, when we get the final shared path through to Otaki, there's an opportunity for it. We did actually have, you might recall, we were looking at a bit of a launch around that, but because it's been pushed out a bit, and a bit of uncertainty around Waka Kotahi, when we're actually going to commission that piece of shared pathway, we've had to kind of pull back a bit on what we were hoping to celebrate. But that's absolutely a key part of what I think attracts people internally and from outside the district to our attractions. So Janet spends half her time in my team and half her time in ED. So she's been a great bridge for the CWB network in particular. But the other part of that equation is the destination parks, which by their very nomenclature are linked to destination management plans. So as we upgrade each of those parks, McLean Park underway at the moment, soon be finished, and then Waikanae Park is next cab off the rank. We're very much looking to make sure we have those linkages with the ED team and making sure that we are enticing people to come and sample the delights of our open spaces in Kapiti. Haruatai Park's the other one, actually. It's a best kept secret up there, so that's on signage and other stuff up there too. Yep.
Yeah, I guess the sporting facilities also come under that heading as well, in terms of bringing people here. If we've got, you know, really high quality sports facilities like the hockey turf, for example, and I know there are some people keen to have like an all-weather athletics track as well. So, you know, how do we, you know, incorporate that side of it in?
Honestly, we've got some work to do there. We have 280 buildings. Well, actually, take away the older person. We've got 150 odd buildings scattered around our parks. Many of them are towards the end of their economic life. Actually, we're coming back to you with an asset management plan around this. So if we take Waikanae Park, for example, which is the one that's coming up, there are sort of 15 to 20 buildings in various stages of dilapidation around that park. We'd very much love to talk, and we are talking with the stakeholders with a view to doing something smarter there. Don't want to get ahead of myself, but we need to think strategically about the stuff in our investment. And that park, gosh, what a terrific facility that you know, and there was some money in the LTP to talk about that as a destination. So we're working with the community board on early doors on how we might actually do that. So yes, I think it's a land of opportunity, Councillor, and our challenge now is to exploit that opportunity.
Yep, cool, thank you.
So thank you, Councillor Cohen. If I can just make a few comments there. In terms of particularly our CWB network, I know that Janice Hill has, she initiated a piece of work about advertising on, is it Wellington Wild? And so a lot of those trails and our parks are on there, and maybe it would be useful for everyone to be aware of that work. But I suppose the key part of that is knowing how that is actually having a positive impact on our tourist numbers and our economy. Ms. Purvin has some comments to make either about that or something else. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you, Chair. Just a note that I just wanted to give an example. I'll have to carefully frame this because we're not allowed to use a certain word, but there's a women's worldwide soccer tournament coming to New Zealand, and I won't state its name because we're not allowed to use it. But we have sort of a collaboration, if you'd like, just in the space around tourism, our open spaces, freedom campaign, to look at how can we create a bit of a tourist attraction, I'll say, trail from the different spaces that the Women's World Cup may be held in Wellington, Palmerston and Hamilton, and we're looking at how we might have a western corridor that goes up to the events and comes back down. So I think that's a really great example of just what we've talked about there, of bringing that to life, and that would be the start of that. And I think our teams have been working really closely together on that, which is going to come to the table soon. There's just a timing with the naming rights of certain things that's making it a bit difficult to publicly talk about. And I did want to say that the questions around the impacts for tourism, that is something that we can bring back to the table and talk to this group as well as some of our other committees about the impacts that we're having on some of the things that we have underway. So we are at the moment undertaking a review. We're about to have a workshop with the Economic Development Kotahitanga Board and the Tourism Advisory Board, looking at the DMP and the actions that are underway, the benefits of those and what's next. So I think it would be valuable to bring that back here.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much for those comments, Chris. Thank you. So now we'll move on to Mr. Moore for your questions, comments.
It's more of a comment and observation, but this kind of this open space strategy seems to fit well over the quagmire of Te Horo, as Mike mentioned briefly before, and of course we went through with a lot of support from Gareth and his team to try to do something over that period, and we can look back and look at the way we approached it could have been done differently, and we'll learn from that, and I hope we won't deviate from the most important objective. Of course, every beach access that I can think of in Te Horo is all for vehicles. And when I read through this really important document, it's not all about driving a vehicle somewhere. And Mike first told me, it's not long after I got elected, that the most contentious issue in our coast community is the beaches. And he's right. And changing it to very small conservative communities, it becomes more contentious and more, and it births over into physical and verbal altercations. So looking at this kind of strategy and how we achieve something that everybody can enjoy is something that I think we in our community at Te Horo, and we've got 3 elected members around here from that who reside in that community, 2 of which reside at the beach community, it would be good to make some kind of achievement with this kind of an overlay. I look at Sophie's and Bede's extraordinary work and their visionary work they're doing for the Rāmari community, and with that kind of approach and an open space strategy, I think could work well to have a really good outcome for the mouth of the Mangoni that people can enjoy without vehicular interference, and not only enjoy it, but it can be rehabilitated and work well with these guiding principles here. And I know Gareth and his team and background with Andy, who have superb knowledge on achieving a good outcome. And people can still enjoy those, as they quote, historical uses for that beach, because there's enough coastline along our particular community to share for every kind of recreation. And I'm really quite buoyed by this document that's been around for some time. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. So now we have Councillor Warwick.
Oh, I just wanted to say to Liz, the Cycleway Walkway Bridleway Committee, Janice is a fantastic, amazing, working on marketing, linking the foothills tracks all the way from Pakakariki or Battle Hill right through to Waidahu and the top over the top. So there's plans afoot. It's just putting it all together. And you know, we're an hour from Wellington. We are kind of we can be a destination. It's just, and she is going to come to full council, I believe, with these plans at some stage.
Yep. I was just going to add, if I may, this is really useful for us when we're dealing with developers as we grow in Kapiti. If they can see a master plan for where we're heading, as they build their infrastructure, it makes it much easier for us to talk about the linkages and how we'd use their reserve contributions to help invest in those linkages in the open spaces.
Thank you, Councillor Warwick. So, Mr. Olsen.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, while I'm listening to this, I'm thinking one area that we seem to be missing on is education. I think, you know, in a lot of our places and our parks and open spaces, we can do a lot more there for the families. You know, when you're going with children, you know, make it fun for them. Have things there where they can go along, you know, tracks and along there, and they can learn about the history, the environment, the impact and stuff. Because what I find here with a lot of our tracks and stuff, and like Waikana River and stuff, if you take your kids, you know, they don't want to go there all the time because it can get quite, you know, a long track, it can be quite boring. But if I go to Palmerston and stuff, where they, you know, have tracks along the rivers, they have, you know, there it's more equipment, you know, along the way. But, you know, the kids love it. They will run, they will do, you know, do the whole track, and they'll run ahead of you, and you know, to keep up with them. But there's other places where we go where there's parks, and, you know, a lot of it is more commercial than, you know, that. But, you know, they go around and they know, like, there's 10 things they have to find, and they go there and they learn about something each way. And I think there's a great way in our parks and stuff that we could, you know, teach our children as they're going around about the environment, about education, about the impact and, what we can do along the way, even if it's, waste or whatever else. And I think that's something that we're missing. And when our children are young, they absorb it, and it's a great time to get this into them, because later on it's much harder, until they get into their adulthood to do it. So if we can do it when they're young and make it fun for them, I think, we have a great opportunity there.
Any comments on that?
Thank you, through you, Madam Chair. I'd probably say I don't think it's quite missing. I just think it's not yet reaching its full potential. We definitely do have that sort of area covered quite well in certain areas, but definitely not meeting what we'd like it to be, our aspirational goals in certain others. Education, quite honestly, is also quite well mentioned in the open space strategy as one of the objectives in certain areas. How we materialise that is an active piece of work that we'd definitely consider in new open space development areas, but could benefit from a whole lot of retrospective revamping as well. So, yeah, definitely a work on area, but not completely absent just yet.
Thank you, Glenn, for raising those, really important, and thank you, Gareth, for your comments. So now, Councillor Hanford.
Yeah, kia ora. Thanks, Korua. Just a couple of quick questions. The first one kind of following on from what Glenn was talking about in terms of education. There's been a bit of kōrero around how we meet some of those objectives that the Te Urahi project was seeking to deliver in terms of telling the Kapiti story and also the mana whenua history. Do you think there's more opportunity to do that within our open spaces network as well, in terms of the mana whenua story specifically?
Yeah, definitely. And Huruatai Park, we've been looking at storyboards, and the Waikanae Beach community is looking at, has been working closely with Whakarongotai on some storyboards down there, but it's a bit patchy. We don't have as Gareth says, it's not coordinated or integrated, but there's definitely patches of it that are flourishing, but we can certainly do more. So yes, with respect to Te Urahi and the story.
Okay, sweet.
Yeah.
Another question around shade that was kind of mentioned earlier on. We've had several times Mandy Savage from the Cancer Society come in and kind of talk about how she's aware that some councils kind of have a shade policy, specifically around their open spaces. Is that something we have?
Is it in here?
I think it's referred to, but it maybe...
So we don't have a shade policy. I guess I need to think about that, but we all have responsibility for protection from the sun, right? Starting at our own, at a personal level, and then there's social things we can do as well. So, top of my head, I don't want to give you advice on the hoof, but I think I would like to give some thought before I came back to you. The Cancer Society is really closely talking to us about non-smoking in our open spaces as well. That's the other thing that's coming through later this year.
And vaping, and the other question that I had was around community gardens. So we've got kind of an urban parks classification in here. Where do community gardens fit in?
So they are, just going to go back on this a few slides. So they're alluded to, but not specifically categorized in their own right. But you can see on that map over there, there are some gardens, like Rongoa Gardens. Within local parks, there are certain categories of reserves that do make provision for them as well. But yeah, not a category on their own, but more inclusive under one of the others where appropriate. Yeah.
Okay, cool. I just feel like that's potentially an area where there's a whole lot of opportunity, kind of in little pockets of space within kind of our current urban environment. Just something to be aware of.
Thank you very much, Councillor Hanford. So, Councillor
Just a quick one from me.
Quick question.
Just following up on what Councillor Hanford mentioned. Yesterday, the Culture and Heritage Strategy kicked off, and I'm just wondering if whether you're linked into that process in terms of telling the iwi story through some of our open spaces. It doesn't have to be storyboards; it can be art as well. So, to me, that's an opportunity to be explored.
Thanks, Councillor. So yes, so the crew that you met with yesterday actually reports to me, so I couldn't make it unfortunately, but we're really keen with that creativity strategy that we are exploring issues such as telling stories through tāmoko and other ways that we haven't thought of yet and certainly aren't in the last arts, supporting the arts strategy, I think the last version was called. So short answer to your question is yes, completely, yeah.
I'll do that in a minute. So thank you very much. So I've actually got a couple of questions myself, so thank you very much for this presentation, and I think it's really good to revisit it after it was landed a year ago. Particularly with some of these other strategies that have been coming along, and I agree with you that it does align very well with, I suppose, our overall strategies. One of the things that I'm wondering about is, so we've got this open space strategy, and we've got all this growth happening. How does, is there any relationship between our open space, and particularly I'm thinking about tree coverage here, between that and the impacts? Is there any relationship that this can have on ensuring that we actually have a good environment that includes both open space, which is mainly or council land or GW land, versus private in the private area, plus the road curbs? Is that actually part of this, or is that something different?
So can I call it road reserve?
Yeah,
So
yeah.
it's another classification of our reserve as road reserve, which is typically where the Burmas typically is what people call road reserve. And the big issue we have with there is tree planting and maintenance and what sorts of trees get to get planted. So that's an ongoing discussion that we have, Councillor, Madam Chair, with our colleagues in the transport team, because clearly it's not just footpath, but also there's a whole bunch of infrastructure that tends to be inside the road reserve. So management of road reserve is something that's front of mind for us, and we will be coming to you with some advice on that through the reserve management plan work that we are doing. But your first question about tree cover, so this is an issue in most cities around the world, but in New Zealand in particular, where people now over time are taking aerial shots of tree cover and measuring it. And in cities like Christchurch, for example, there's been a terrific, that's the wrong word, but there's been an awful drop in the percentage of shade cover that's provided by trees because of development. We don't actually have in place a measure that is shade cover provided by trees. We're constrained by all of the planning rules that you're very familiar with, but it is something we watch very closely. Trees can be quite divisive in the community, and we have some experience of that here in Kapiti. Everybody loves their tree until the wind blows it down and takes out their power lines or destroys their view. Then people kind of want to chop them down. So that's a great oversimplification, but it tends to be kind of the sorts of issues that make trees really divisive. So we're thinking about that now. We know that there's some advice we'd like to bring you around that, but it's not actually on the work program for the next 6 months or so at least. But we're very familiar with what's going on with tree cover and shade, and we're monitoring that closely. But we don't actually have a rule in place that says we must have 25% shade cover or anything like that.
So thank you for that, and I suppose part of having a rule is knowing what we've got in the first instance, and it sounds like we haven't been able to do that, which is, I'm just making comment.
I don't think we have done that. It was actually quite easy to do with GIS now and with aerial photography. Yeah.
Yeah, and I suppose so. Obviously, you can actually control what is in the KCDC owned open space, but when it comes to the rest of the district, it's more difficult. But I suppose then we do have a district plan, and that's when you can actually influence it as well. So the two actually work probably hand in hand together.
Yeah, the provisions in the existing district plan
Yes.
are quite limited around the eco zones.
Yeah, and I suppose it is reviewed every now and again, and so maybe that's something for us councillors to think about. yeah, and I understand how trees can be divisive at times, but there are some cities and countries that have done it well, and maybe it's learning some of the learning about some of the ways that they've actually managed to get it, to be a really positive in their environments. So thank you for that. So my other question is in relation to these open spaces, and there's been a lot of comment, like Kim made the comment about potentially destroying our ecosystem, but I want to take it. My question takes us a little bit further in terms of what types of buildings, can these open spaces be used for other things, which include buildings, and could they end up be used for housing, for example?
Not easily. In order to do that, so this comes back to the reserve management plans that we're working through at the moment. So all of our reserves are required to be gazetted under the Reserves Act, and in order to put housing, for example, on a reserve, the gazetting process needs to be undone. I think that can only be signed off by the Minister of Conservation.
okay.
I think so. It can be done, but it takes that's a long and drawn out process that requires significant engagement and consultation. That's not to say that for some areas we wouldn't contemplate it, but it cannot be a kind of it's not a simple process that can be done without significant public engagement.
Okay, thank you very much. So I think that brings to an end another very good conversation on our open spaces and our strategy. So before we have a break, I was just wondering whether, Mike, you'd like to give us an update on the Te Horo Mangoni Stream access situation, please.
Sure, thanks, Madam Chair. Thanks for the opportunity. So you recall the issue we had where we put some blocks in just prior to Christmas in order to prevent vehicle access to the beach at the northern end of Te Horo, and the subsequent fallout from us doing that. We have consciously had a calling off period. We have remained engaged with the community, but we haven't tried to force anything. We're still in that area at the moment. A couple of things coming up tonight. We have the meeting of the Waikanae Community Board, where the police, who are the enforcement agency, will be in attendance. We're not expecting any great revelation from the police being in attendance. They've been quite upfront with us about what they can actually do, and it's quite conservative. They have advised us that if people are able to take photographs or videos and send them through, then they will follow up where they can. But in the same breath, they did acknowledge that many of the issues we have with vehicles and bikes, dirt bikes in particular, don't have plates. Right? So that's great that they've offered that, but we're realistic about what they can actually do with respect to beach access in that part of the coast. I think more pleasingly, we have Chris's team, through the work with the visioning around the district, we have added beach access into the work that Chris is looking at with respect to visioning, and Te Horo, the community at Te Horo is really keen to figure out what it is that makes Te Horo unique, what gives it its mojo. And so this needs to be part of that conversation, and I think that we think that's a nice, safe way for us to bring the community together to have this discussion, rather than to kind of drive it apart by trying to force it at this point. So that's our thinking at this stage. We're not forcing it. Appreciate, Councillor, that in September it will be whitebaiting season, I believe, and that will be a potential another little kind of rub area. We're realistic about our ability to get this signed off by September. I don't think that's practical, so I want to be upfront with you about that. But just to let you know that we're conscious of all these things that are swirling around. We're trying our best. You're aware as well as we are that this is part of a wider issue that we have around beach access in New Zealand, in fact. And so between Chris, James and myself, because this comes down to regulation as well, we regularly touch base in talking about this and watching it and trying to figure out the best path through the minefield that is beach access across the district, but specifically in Te Horo. If we can't sort Te Horo, then when we turn our attention to Paraparaumu and Waikanae and Otaki, we're going to have the same issues on steroids.
So thank you. Any questions? Mr. Moore.
I'll just make a quick observation, and thank you. It hasn't entirely gone off the radar, and some people may think it has. But as I mentioned in some early discussions, in taking a broader approach to this is going to have a better outcome. that we want. I think if we talk about solving one little issue, which is passionate to some different groups for various and very disparate different reasons, we will not get anywhere very fast. We'll have more aggression online, and we'll have more aggression in face-to-face, as some people have alluded to our last community board meeting, who were quite fearful of their interaction on the beach and some of that kind of behaviour. So taking a more broader approach to a vision of a community and what we want as a community, like, which I hasten to sound like a broken record, which is successfully occurring down in Ramari and happened with the Waikanai Beach Futures document quite some years ago, is a far better way, I think, to answer this kind of question. I'm sure if we put out a document and ask lots of people to participate on how they perceive their community and what they want as part of that makeup, we would win this issue in a second, because it wouldn't be an issue. I'm quite convinced about that, because the broader discussion of the people who demand to have a vehicle access at that point would be outweighed by a broader discussion of how we include everybody's requests. So I'm really pleased that it's still on the radar and you haven't entirely forgotten it. But I mean, I acknowledge too that it is complicated and is difficult navigating against those folk who are really quite hungry for keeping it as it's always been.
Thank you, Mr. Moore. So, and Councillor Coe.
Yeah, just look, I still have a concern about allowing the community to feel as though this is a democratic process. And while we can engage with them in terms of their vision for the community, you know, what if their vision comes back and says, oh, we want to be able to drive on the beach? You know, that's not acceptable. So somehow we have to find a balance there. And so I think we need to, yes, by all means, incorporate that, but not be bound by that. And so there still needs to be a process where we come to a conclusion by a certain date. And I guess I'm keen to still see some timelines around when we might have a way forward on this. And it needs to be before next summer, really, so we can, so that we've got time to implement whatever we decide to do before the hordes of people arrive in the summertime. I'm not so worried about the white baiting side of it, because they tend to be reasonably well behaved. It's the hoons that I'm concerned about. So yeah, so that's my concerns. Thanks.
So thank you, Councillor Coe. I actually have a couple of questions. So, so it's good that we've got this visioning program working. But I suppose even with that process occurring, we still have a beach bylaw that has certain rules and regulations in place. And is it a case of where, you know, I don't know whether people are actually abiding by that bylaw there or not, and whether council is actually, well, I suppose it's the police who administer that. My question, I suppose, is when is the visioning work going to start? Because at least that will start those conversations in the community. Yeah, so Chris would like to speak to that. Thank you.
Thank you. I met with the chair of the Waikanai Community Board and a group of representatives from the Te Horo Beach village, and they have indicated interest in doing a specific piece for the Te Horo Beach Village, which would link into the wider work piece of work that's underway around visioning. They're already beginning to do some work just to get a feel from their part of the community about the questions that we've been talking about what do we want to experience, what do we want to be like into the future. And I just want to put an assurance in there, Councillor Coe, that one of the things that we've already been talking about is there's going to be a real need to unpack what I'm calling the why of what we want to be, so that we, I guess I'm trying to indicate that there's going to be a lot of things that come through this process from a lot of different groups, and understanding the why and how those whys connect will be really important, rather than just describing a thing that we want. So an example of that is I know that the Te Horo Beach Village community has some views, specific views around trees and the size and the scope and the specific type that they'd be. And I've said to them, we really understand why you want to be interested in those things, but my point of describing that is they've already got work underway. We are going to be looking at working alongside them at creating some opportunities for some neighbourhood chats, just as we did with Remo, of chat to your neighbour about emergency preparedness. We're thinking of going in and seeing if we can have some of those. So short end of the stick is we'll be starting with that part of the community, or one of those areas of the community, because they're ready to go and they've indicated strong interest. So whether we're able to table something from their end that feels and is shaped about right, at least as a pilot for Waikanae, I think could be quite possible to achieve before September. So we could try and align those timelines if that's something that's meaningful for this process.
So thank you, Chris, for that. So then it's great that this process has sort of started informally, but I assume that there will be some structure put around the criteria, or there was some structure and criteria put around, or the scope here, so that with council staff involvement, so that and is the outcome some type of document, such as was done for Waikanae Beach, or is it going to be some different type of output?
We've been, in my discussions to date, and to be fair, I'm going to be having a wider discussion with the whole of the Waikanae Community Board, but my discussions with the chair had been, we're anticipating that we will be articulating the kind of vision statement in an infographic. It may be similar to what we've seen in the Raumati example, but what we'd be doing is saying there is a specific area of Te Horo Beach Village and there's other parts, so that when we're describing the area, that it's meaningful to the community for which it's come from. So something will come back here. On the 18th of May at the next Strategy, Ops and Finance meeting, we're actually going to be talking about just that. What happens when we go out, it comes back, and what do we do with it? So there definitely is structure about that. And I just want to be clear, one of the things that we've messaged as we've talked to different people in the community is this is it's a marathon, it's not a sprint. We're not going to do this and make decisions. It's actually got 3 phases to it. The first is to articulate aspiration. The second is to go, how would we get there? What pathways could we use? And the third is to identify that preferred pathway. That would come back here. So so there is a bit of a process to it. That won't be done by September, but there would be an indication of the aspiration that part of the Te Horo community has, which could help to inform the space.
Thank you very much for that, Chris. I think that gives us a good understanding as to how that, I suppose, that piece of work is going to progress. So if I can just ask if we can continue to have update dates as needed on this subcommittee. So now we've been going for nearly 2 hours. We'll have a 15-minute break, if that's okay, and come back at 11:45. Thank you.